organization, women make up 70% of care workers in 104 countries analyzing the study. In the Hubei region in China, where the virus first broke out, the figure is closer to 90%. This meant that although men are more likely to face serious consequences or die from the virus itself, which is mostly a biological effect, women are more likely to actually contract it based on their position in society. Outside of care work, women are still at a disadvantage when it comes to the crisis. Overrepresented in temporary and precarious contracts, and especially in closed-down workplaces such as bars or restaurants or shops, many women don't profit from government support and furlough schemes at all, and even after the crisis, they'll be more likely to lose their jobs. That's without even mentioning the unpaid labour that falls on the shoulders of women, estimated at being worth over £1.24 trillion in the UK before the crisis even started. So even the lucky women who can work from home are now expected to be just as productive as before while caring for their children, their families, their homes. And of course, we have the issue of domestic violence, which is shown to increase during crises and especially during lockdowns like the one we're experiencing right now. Now, there's obviously a lot more to be said, and we have an amazing group of speakers this evening. We'll cover a variety of subjects to do with the huge issue of coronavirus and women. So first, we'll hear from Sue Berry, who is an NEU member from Kent and Medway Socialist Alternative, and she will focus on the impact of the COVID crisis on women workers. Then we'll hear from Eleanor Crossley-Malone. Eleanor is a member of our sister organisation in Ireland, the Socialist Party. Now, both of our parties are members of the same international organisation, the International Socialist Alternative, which has activists all around the world in over 30 countries. And as you might be able to tell, one of them is Israel Palestine, where I joined the organisation. So Eleanor is also an activist with ROSA, which is the socialist feminist movement in Belfast, and she'll talk about reproductive rights in the era of the coronavirus. So we're really looking forward to hear about the situation in Northern Ireland with that. Next up, we'll hear from Sophie Patel, who is West Yorkshire Socialist Alternative member and domestic violence campaigner. We'll go into the effect this crisis has had on domestic violence. And after her, we'll listen to Fiona Pachizadeh, who is a UCU and Manchester Socialist Alternative member, and she'll be speaking in a personal capacity and will discuss childcare and home pressures under the lockdown. And then last but not least, we have Becky Heaney from the Socialist Alternative Political Committee and the International Socialist Alternative Women's Bureau, who will talk about a socialist feminist solution to those issues and the steps that feminist movements can take to combat them in the short and the long term. Now, I'd like to take this opportunity to ask you all to help us spread this important discussion as much as you can. So please take a moment to like this live stream, to share it, and also don't forget to start watch parties if you can and invite your friends to watch with you. We also really want to know who's listening, so please let us know in the comments below where you're listening from, who you are. I want to know everything. So also, towards the end of the stream, we'll take some questions from the audience. So if you want to ask the panel anything at all, do comment with your questions, and we'll pick a few to answer to. So without further ado, let's hear from our first speaker, Sue.
Hello, Yara. Thank you for inviting me to speak at tonight's rally. It's great to be here. The current COVID crisis comes on the back of 10 years of austerity, a deliberate and ideologically driven policy designed to cut public spending and to drive down the living standards of working people. The decimation of public services has hit women hardest. Research carried out by the House of Commons revealed that women have borne 86% of austerity since 2010. And there are three main reasons for this. Firstly, women make up 2/3 of public sector workers. Secondly, we rely on these services to a greater degree than men. And thirdly, the benefit reforms of universal credit have been catastrophic for women. Austerity has led to increased poverty and greater inequality. Over 1/3 of women workers earn less than £15,000 a year. Almost half of all lone parents live in poverty, and the majority of them are women. Although there are now more women in paid employment than at any time in history, we are far more likely to work part-time or more likely to be in temporary or precarious employment, as Yara was saying in the introduction, on 0 hours contracts. On average, these jobs have lower rates of pay than full-time permanent employment. Public sector workers have experienced year-on...
Oh, just say yes then. You know you want to.
We have a gender pay gap in the UK of 18%. Many jobs carried out by women, such as nursing, social care, cleaning, retail and hospitality, are also roles that attract low pay and are widely regarded as having low value. I'd like to nail the myth perpetuated by the Tories that low pay means low skilled. Let's take care workers as an example. I heard an interview with a care worker recently who described the wide range of skills that she uses on a daily basis. Typically, she's responsible for almost every aspect of her patients' lives: their mobility, their medication and their diet, as well as personal care, which may include managing catheters or stoma bags. She collaborates closely with other professionals to ensure the safety and well-being of the people she cares for. These aspects of her job are complex and skilled. But after a decade of austerity, the salary of care workers has been driven down to between £15,200 and £19,500. Most care workers choose to work in care because they want to make a difference to people's lives, and certainly not because they are incapable of anything else. What sort of a society rewards such vital and important work with such low pay? So we are now in the middle of a global health crisis, and it is women workers who are on the front line as key workers. In the UK, 89% of nurses are women, 80% of jobs in adult care are done by women, 70% of teachers are women, and this rises to 82% in primary schools. 58% of retail workers are women, and if you think about supermarkets, most checkout and shop floor staff are women. At this critical time, it has been women workers who have been instrumental in keeping the wheels of the economy turning, as well as looking after the most vulnerable in our society, whether that's in hospital, whether that's in care homes or in schools. So how exactly are our key workers rewarded and valued by this government and the capitalist system they represent? Despite their weekly display of clapping on the steps of Downing Street on a Thursday night, it's clear that Boris Johnson, Matt Hancock and the rest of the Tory government see women workers as expendable. The scandal around PPE is perhaps the clearest example of how poorly valued our key workers are. The failure to stockpile and distribute enough PPE across health and social care is nothing short of criminal. A failure to act on the recommendations that came out of exercise sickness has put health workers' lives at risk, leaving nursing and other hospital staff exposed to high rates of infection, resulting in a tragic and unnecessary loss of 144 lives, and that's according to official statistics. Within care home settings, only a fraction of PPE required has been supplied, with individual homes having to buy their own on the open market at hugely inflated prices, because that's how capitalism works. To date, 131 care staff have died. The Office of National Statistics reporting this week that care workers are dying from COVID at twice the rate of the general public. The government have no plans to keep key workers safe and take no responsibility for their deaths. Coroners carrying out inquests on NHS staff have been told not to consider a lack of PPE as contributing to those deaths. And Yara indicated earlier on in the introduction, young women workers are disproportionately likely to work in sectors which have been shut down by the ongoing lockdown. Almost 40% of young women under the age of 30 work in sectors that have been closed, including restaurants, shops, leisure, travel and tourism. And we've already seen 12,000 redundancies at British Airways, 3,500 redundancies from Virgin Atlantic, and 3,000 job losses at Ryanair. Beyond the furlough scheme, we can expect many more job losses, plunging workers into poverty and uncertainty. What we can be certain is that the Tories will make us pay yet again for a crisis of their own making. Rishi Sunak has already signalled a 2-year pay freeze for public sector workers, as well as an increase in taxes that will fall heavily on women workers who have been on the front line throughout the COVID pandemic. Capitalism and Tory rule is effectively austerity without end. Coming out of this crisis, it is clear we are going to initially face some defensive struggles to protect women workers. I think teachers and education workers are going to be in the forefront of these. Already, 7,500 education workers have joined the NEU since Johnson's announcement that schools will return on June the 1st, because workers recognise that there is power in a union. I think that this shows education workers are prepared to mobilise in order to resist the drive to open up schools prematurely. A successful struggle in the education sector will undoubtedly give confidence and raise expectations of all workers everywhere. Historically, this has always been the role that women have played in our movement. Often the first to go into struggle over issues of health and safety or low pay, giving the signal for the wider movement to take up more offensive struggles for better conditions. From the Match Women of 1888, who set up the first trade union of women workers, which heralded the Great Dock Strike of 1889 and the birth of mass trade unionism in Britain, to the machinists at Fort Dagenham who won the historic right to equal pay in 1968. Women have demonstrated time and time again their combativity and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds toward lasting changes. Once again, I believe women will be in the forefront of the struggles ahead. A fight back is developing in the workplaces. In Socialist Alternative, we believe the struggles ahead are political. We won't achieve lasting change until we are rid of capitalism. True equality will only be achieved by overthrowing a system that is based on the oppression and inequality of women. Join us and fight for a socialist future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue, and thank you everyone for bearing with us while we fix the sound. Now, this was a very, very interesting speech, I think. It's clear that all workers have been hurt massively by this crisis from both a health and an economic perspective. But the women workers have really carried the burden, like they usually do. And it's also clear from what you said, Sue, that the government isn't actually going to solve these issues for us. And we need an appropriate response from women's organizations and trade unions to fight back against this government that puts up the interests of women workers at the bottom of the list, even during an actual pandemic. Now, we Socialist Alternative have been campaigning throughout the lockdown and organizing that fight back exactly. But in order to keep on doing that now, and after the lockdown measures are reduced as well, we need funds. So we're not backed by any rich billionaires, and our finances rely completely on the donations from our members, as well as people just like you who want to support the struggle. So I'd really encourage you to think, is there anything that you can spare? Even £5 would make a huge difference to us. And if you can donate through the link that's just being posted right now in the comments. And please don't forget to tell us that you've donated in the comments as well. Now, next, we'll be hearing from Eleanor about reproductive rights during this crisis. So, Eleanor, go ahead.
Thanks. And thanks for inviting me to speak today. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right. So usually when large-scale emergencies occur, such as natural disasters and pandemics, one of the first services to be cut or restricted by national capitalist governments is women's health services, in particular reproductive care and access to abortion. And I think this is really because women's health is usually viewed by these states as a kind of optional extra at the best of times, rather than something that's absolutely fundamental. And during the coronavirus pandemic, many governments around the world and state legislatures in the US have tried to use the necessary shutdown of sections of the economy and the need for social distancing, either to surreptitiously undermine or completely remove access to abortion, or to try and rush through legislation that introduces outright bans at a time when it's very difficult, of course, to organise large-scale protest actions to stop this from happening. In Northern Ireland, the coronavirus hit at a time when we had just won the lifting of the Victorian-era abortion ban. In the rest of the UK, the abortion ban 1967 introduced exemptions to that ban. But in Northern Ireland, it stayed in place until October of last year, when Westminster directly lifted the ban under a great deal of pressure from a grassroots movement. And at that point, there was still no local executive because the sectarian ruling parties had been unable to negotiate a power sharing agreement. And the role that we've played in both in Rosa's socialist feminist movement and in the Socialist Party and International Socialist Alternative in terms of achieving that victory was significant. We helped force an emergency debate on abortion rights in Westminster in the aftermath of the repeal referendum victory that took place in the south of Ireland. We did this through our protest action with Women on Web, who are the main telemedicine provider of abortion pills worldwide, where a number of Rosa activists stood outside the courthouse in Belfast and took the safe but illegal abortion pills. In doing that, we sought to highlight the fact that these pills are being used in Northern Ireland every day, and also that they're roughly 10 times safer than Viagra, which is available over the counter without prescription in pharmacies. The ruling parties were busy debating what kind of abortion access system they could get away with in Northern Ireland when the current crisis began. And they were happy to continue forcing women to obtain their own pills illegally or to travel to England until the end of the year. But social distancing measures have, of course, made it impossible for people to travel. And so medical practitioners were given the green light to start administering abortions within Northern Ireland. Telemedicine abortion is now allowed in England and Scotland up to 10 weeks in Wales. But the DUP Health Minister, Robin Swan, has resisted that in Northern Ireland. And early abortion by telemedicine is, of course, by far the safest way to administer abortions in this pandemic. Restrictions also risk forcing women to continue pregnancies until medical abortion is no longer an option, and then surgical procedures become necessary. So restrictions like this actually have no benefit at all in terms of actually slowing the spread of the virus. And of course, this is an international question as well, and an international struggle. At the start of April, the right-wing Polish government announced plans to tighten the country's already draconian abortion laws. Currently, abortion is only allowed in cases of rape or incest, threat to the woman's life, or fatal fetal abnormality. And the latter reason counts for almost all of the small number of legal abortions performed in Poland. And that was exactly what the right-wing government was trying to ban. And the reason they attempted this during the pandemic, I think, is important. It is that a previous attempt to introduce this law in 2016 was met with furious mass protests, including a women's strike, and a similar law was defeated again in 2018. But street demonstrations are now prohibited in Poland under lockdown measures. Some activists have still protested while observing social distancing. And there was also a virtual protest where people uploaded videos to oppose the ban. And we helped organise an online campaign to send messages of solidarity to all of those fighting the ban in Poland. And on the 16th of April, the Parliament deferred a final decision on the bill, but it could still make a comeback. And on the same day, actually, they also delayed voting on a bill that could see teachers providing sex education jailed under paedophilia charges. In some cases, the law hasn't technically changed, but there are unofficial temporary closures of abortion clinics. In Moscow alone, only 3 of the city's 44 abortion clinics are continuing to provide abortions. And that means that 100 to 150,000 women will be left without access to abortion in the course of this crisis. And this is in a country where Putin in recent years removed legal protections for victims of domestic violence. And of course, those things create the conditions for nightmare situations for many women who might be trapped in quarantine with their abusers and unable to end a pregnancy that could well leave them even more financially dependent on those same abusers. In Argentina, in the past years, we've seen massive movements against gender-based violence and harassment, and also for abortion rights. And on the 1st of March, there was finally an announcement by the president that they would debate a bill to legalize abortion in Congress. Within days, Argentina's first coronavirus death was confirmed. The borders were shut and the legislature closed. And the abortion bill's review is now indefinitely postponed and its future is uncertain. Somewhere that is often forgotten about in discussions about abortion access is Malta, where it's still illegal in all circumstances. And of course, it's not a coincidence that some of the most regressive abortion laws still exist in places where the Catholic Church has historically held state power or influence over the state. But the USA is also a major battleground for abortion rights, particularly in many southern states, where conservative representatives have attempted to use the coronavirus as an excuse to limit abortion, and that includes Arkansas, Indiana, Ohio, Mississippi, Texas, and others. All have classified abortion as a non-essential medical procedure, which can make terminations impossible to access in all but very specific circumstances. For example, if a woman's life is immediately threatened. Some states have already brought in intermittent bans, which were then halted by federal judges. But new rules in Arkansas are now effectively blocking women from accessing abortion by forcing them to track down a test for coronavirus and get a negative result beforehand. So I think the question arises of what we can actually do at this time when we're all isolating in our separate houses. I think for me, international solidarity is key. And we should remember that victories for equality anywhere in the world raise the sights of those who are fighting in other countries against oppressive laws and remind them at all times of what is possible through struggle. And isolating doesn't mean that we have to stay silent. We have to make our voices heard in any way that we can. But the second, and I think the most important point, is that these capitalist governments would like physical isolation from each other to mean political atomization. And we have to make sure that it doesn't. We have to use this time to politically consolidate ourselves and to organise so that when lockdown restrictions are lifted, we are stronger than we were before. And we have to build a movement that links the struggle for reproductive rights and for equality to the struggle for a socialist society. So I would urge everyone who's interested to contact Socialist Alternative and get involved.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Eleanor. That was really, really important and really, really powerful. And I think it's always great to hear from our comrades around the world, and especially about something like that has had such an impact on the women's movement globally. like Eleanor said. And I think it's obvious that the capitalist system cynically uses this crisis to reduce the rights of women to our bodies. So it's crucial, like Eleanor said, that we organize and fight the system itself. And like Eleanor said, we need an organization to do that. We can't do it on our own. So that's why we need you to join Socialist Alternative. So use the link in the comments to fill out the join form and help us grow and fight the system. Now, I also want to say that we've got a great start here to build this movement. People are watching us from all over, Cardiff to Paisley, the US to Ireland, really everywhere. So we also have a solidarity message from Amy Cousins from Women's Lives Matter campaign. So that's great. Thank you so much, Amy. And also want to remind our listeners that we will be taking questions at the end of this discussion. So please put your questions down in the comment now so we can ask them at the end. Our next speaker is going to be Sophie, who will talk about domestic violence. Now, I'd like to warn our listeners that Sophie is going to speak about her own personal experience with domestic violence, so just be prepared for that. And unfortunately, Sophie couldn't be here today with us, so we had to pre-record her contribution, but I'm sure it's going to be just as good, so let's hear it from Sophie.
Hi everyone, it's Sophie Patel here from the Huddersfield branch, West Yorkshire Socialist Alternative. I was a victim of witnessing domestic violence throughout my childhood, that my mum even had to get away from my dad, and in doing so left me with my father, just to get away and look after her eldest son, who isn't my father's child. I then was a survivor of domestic violence, aged 25 from my previous marriage. I escaped that house with my 2 children. Now, the first time I got away from domestic violence was when I was 16. I worked very hard to get my GCSEs, and my dream, my goal was to graduate at university in a subject within media. My grandmother told me that I would not be going to college, therefore I decided to leave, and I left and I found my mum within the first day of leaving home. My mum couldn't house me due to personal situation, so she called social services, which they rehoused me in a hostel in Huddersfield. Since I've been moved around from place to place, around Huddersfield, into Brighouse and also Halifax, and never at that time actually had a set home. I also continued to go to college. In these hostels, although there were support workers available, you're never really taught on how to notice when you're putting yourself in a vulnerable position, and because I wasn't aware, I ended up putting myself in a vulnerable position in which I was then groomed. It wasn't until recently, due to mental health issues, I had a psychotic episode in which I went into my past in front of the police and ended up telling them what was happening. I'm still yet to chase that up with the police and take it to court, but I haven't got enough mental strength for that right now. But anyway, I met my ex-husband when I was 18 and we got married when I was 21. My father came back into my life and was very happy about everything because he was an Indian Muslim and of a higher class. At the time I was still at university, but when I fell pregnant and had my child, my first child, I decided I didn't want to go back. Not just yet anyway. I was still new to being a mum. But after my second child, I decided it's time to go back to university. My ex-husband told me to pick between university or him. I picked university. I shouldn't have had to choose, but in that situation, I knew what I wanted and he had to stand by me, but he didn't. The emotional abuse started, and then it went on to physical abuse in front of my children. Once he grabbed me by my throat, I honestly thought I was losing my life. I felt very faint, and the last thing I would have heard was my children screaming. But I continued to go to uni and put on a brave face. I carried on with extracurriculum and I started speaking at Educating Huddersfield. It wasn't then when a close friend said to me, "How can you empower other people when you do not empower yourself?" So one day, after a huge argument, after he'd been through my phone found nothing on my phone, threw the phone at me and went to work. That fear I felt in me made me realise I can't do this anymore and I can't put my children through this. If I stay, my children will grow up to have the memories that I have. So I rang the police and with their advice I left. Student union officers at the University of Huddersfield helped me over the weekend and put me in an apartment, one of their own apartments, with my 2 children. And then on the Monday, I was rehoused in student housing. And the university provided me with a grant to help me get me and my children settled and set up with essentials. It took 9 months for me to get justice from my ex-husband for assaulting me after I had left home, as he was still part of the children's life. It went into my final year at university, and I still remember the stress from my dissertation, work placement, everything a third-year student faces, and standing up in that box with no family there, just me, Mike, and 2 of my friends. He was found guilty of assault, and the outcome of that was 2-year bail and a restraining order. I actually wrote a letter to the judge to get him the mental health support that he needs to understand how to be a better person, so that no one else has to ever go through what I did if he was to meet somebody else. Unfortunately, that wasn't heard, and he got away with a slap on the hand. All this triggered mental health issues. That when I started a campaign for Kirklees Against Domestic Violence, following on from Women's Lives Matter, I had to stop because my mental health was just an absolute mess. I'm still, since last year, waiting for support. I keep getting passed backwards and forwards. But before this, I tackled misogyny in my community. This was when I returned back to university. I went to an activist training course and I used skills on my community. I was a volunteer for a women's section of a magazine. I was the editor, manager and writer, as well as the only female presenter for the radio show. A job opportunity came up in an executive position for the magazine. I had the skills and the qualifications for this, and I came forward. No one else did, but unfortunately I couldn't have the job because I was a woman. So I created a petition and I threatened them with this petition and the media, even after being threatened of trying to westernise the women, and I won. I'm sorry, I'm having to keep this short because I know that I've got to stick to a time. But anyway, I got into campaigning after I left home for Women's Lives Matter, but during my campaigning a lot of people said, what about men? And someone who stands for equality, I couldn't let that slide. So I started Kirklees Against Domestic Violence, which I'm hoping to start up again, in which people help people. So while we are still fighting to challenge the government and austerity, we can still support one another, we can still be here to listen to each other, and we can still raise awareness. And I think the way to change the way domestic violence is increasing is by changing the ideology of certain communities and certain households that domestic violence is okay. Now, one of the ways to do this is by going into schools, representing Kirklees Against Domestic Violence, and speaking with pupils at the school and explaining why this is not okay, and that if they feel this is happening in their house, to come and talk to the teachers, to speak to hotlines that are available out there, or to simply speak to representatives of Kirklees Against Domestic Violence. So that's one way. Another way is people supporting people donating things and essentials for people who have had to leave home. Having a network in which men and women feel that, you know, there is help there and there's going to be some form of help might give them the confidence to break away from domestic violence. It's going to be a long journey to change how people think domestic violence is okay and to change people's views on domestic violence, but it's all about starting now, and that's what Kirklees Against Domestic Violence is about. I'm also writing a book that it's called Her Eyes Don't Lie, which is demonstrating a story of a young girl, me in a different character, on her journey through domestic violence and how that has affected her. And any money raised from the sellings of this book will go to support Kirklees Against Domestic Violence. And that's all I have to say. And thank you for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Sophie, for this really painful personal experience. It was obviously very hard to share this. I think I speak on behalf of everyone who's been listening to when I say thank you so much for sharing this with us. I think the points that Sophie made were especially significant in the context of coronavirus. We already know that 25%, we've seen a 25% rise in domestic violence since the start of the lockdown. Now, even before the lockdown started, women aged 15 to 44 were more likely to die or have serious ill health issues as a result of domestic abuse than because of cancer, car accidents, war, and malaria combined. But at the same time, we've seen £8 million that were cut from domestic abuse services in 2010. So even during this crisis, domestic violence care professionals did not make it onto the government's list of essential jobs. Mental health is also a major issue that Sophie talked about. Sophie said the effects of domestic abuse aren't just for the duration of the abuse itself. They impact mental health in a very serious way for the future as well. But the government has cut mental health services by 8% every year since 2011. So we absolutely need to change the perception of domestic violence and to fight within communities and households, just like Sophie said. But we need to go even further, I think, because domestic abuse is a systemic issue. There has to be a systemic solution to it to actually stop it. And that includes better education and support systems in schools, like Sophie said, and also the democratic control of refugees and support for victims and massive investment in social services so that no one has to experience the same things that Sophie's just described. But it also means fighting against a system, the system of capitalism, that benefits from the vulnerable position of women in society. So I think Sophie's also touched a little bit on the impact of childcare on victims, which is a very important point that relates us to generally the way that childcare is organized in society. And that brings us on to our next speaker, Fiona, who will be going deeper into the home pressures under the lockdown and childcare as well. So over to you, Fiona.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much. I want to say obviously hello and solidarity to everybody watching. I wanted to start with a little bit of background. The employment rate for mothers with dependent children has steadily risen over the past 20 years in the UK. Figures from the Labour Force survey show that women with dependent children are actually the group that have experienced the fastest employment growth over this time. This is compared to men overall and to women without dependent children. Now, as has been outlined by Sue earlier, the nature of this work is often low paid, it's often precarious, and there's also a disgraceful gender pay gap. Women have been increasingly drawn into the workplace to take on these kind of roles. At the same time as we've been drawn into the workplace, the cost of childcare has skyrocketed, especially when you've got preschool children. A full-time nursery place for a 2-year-old is around £250 a week on average in the UK. And there's also a big problem with actually getting an adequate supply of places. Even if you are able to pay that kind of amount of money, actually getting a place that fits in with your working pattern, it can be incredibly difficult. And many parents have had to rely on family members and others to help out with childcare due to these costs. At the same time as we're increasingly working outside of the home, surveys have continually shown that women still shoulder the large majority of unpaid work inside the home. So talking about things like childcare, housework, laundry, cooking, those kind of tasks. And the European Time Use Survey results show that it's the case for every group from the under 25s upwards. The women are taking on those roles. As Yara was mentioning earlier as well, ONUS figures put the total unpaid work a value of over £1 trillion, which is equivalent to over half of the GDP. So we already have these increasingly and enormous pressures and expectations and contradictions on women workers who have dependent children. And these come from the profit system, the system of capitalism. And the overwhelming majority of lone parents are actually women, approximately 90% according to the ONS. So these women are having to shoulder all of this on their own. Now, the current lockdown has hugely heightened all of these pressures to completely unrealistic levels. With the closure of schools and other childcares, in large numbers, we've had to take on the role of full-time educators for our children, while at the same time continuing to work. And that's in addition to all our unpaid housework and household tasks. Now, there are obviously so many challenges. And any parent will say, obviously, looking after our kids, it's amazing, it's rewarding, certainly beyond anything that I've ever experienced, but it's also extremely challenging. And these challenges have been much higher in lockdown for the lower paid. Many families are in small and cramped accommodation with no outside space. There's also a lot of rented housing that is in poor quality. There's a much lower likelihood of actually getting repairs done at the moment if something goes wrong in your house. Access to the internet and to devices that actually go on the internet is assumed. It's not always the case, especially if you've got a few children like myself. You have to have several different things that you can go on the internet with. And for those of us who are working from home, there is a pressure on us to continue to complete work as normal, despite having to care and educate for our children completely simultaneous. Personally, as a teaching assistant at the university, I've been having to give tutorials online that are recorded for students to use and are also live, whilst literally at the same time homeschooling my children and providing endless snacks, dealing with all the kind of things that you have to deal with during childcare. Is extreme multitasking. And some of us are also having to continue to pay for childcare places, even though we can't actually use them in order to keep our places for the time after lockdown when we can use them again. And family members obviously can't help out with childcare in the way that they used to. Also, when you're alone at home with children and you're trying to work, how can we go and do socially distanced shopping? How can we do our exercise? Anyone who's looked after kids and done those sorts of things in normal times and know how difficult it is anyway. It's basically impossible to carry out those tasks at the moment. And with the latest government announcements last Sunday, some workers are getting forced back into work, even though there's no childcare in place, and there's increasing pressure on some workers to do that. Some will obviously be forced to send their children back to school when they reopen. And this is going to be despite the stance of the education unions that it is too soon. There isn't enough scientific evidence for it to go back safely. And that's also now been backed up by the BMA. But something that has happened in the lockdown that I've certainly found in my local area, and I know many others have found it, is communities have increasingly rallied round to help. There's been a growth and a kind of, in some places, like an explosion of community groups who are growing and communicating online. People are helping out their neighbours, doing shopping, providing food for those who are ill, helping out in many, many different ways with all sorts of a variety of tasks that are needed, bringing their own skills and capabilities to help others out in their local area. And to me, this is just such a huge example. It goes against all these ideas that are pushed on us, that people are selfish in general, they're too selfish for socialism, and they only care about these individual circumstances. And obviously these ideas can be seen to be false, even in the current crisis situation, where you'd expect those things to be even more true. I think that rather than us kind of doing housework individually in the home and being kind of imprisoned there and isolated, this sort of thing we're seeing with communities rallying around, I think to me it shows some really very realistic possibilities in the future for socialised housework, for community canteens, for community laundries, and people basically giving what they can whilst taking what they need. We've also seen in the lockdown the importance of being organised in a trade union, even and especially if you're in precarious employment like I am. My local UCU reps were able to get agreement from the university management that all casualised teaching assistants would get paid for all of our contracted hours this semester, even if we couldn't complete this work for any sort of reason, which includes childcare. And we see that trade union membership is growing significantly at the moment as well. Now, we in Socialist Alternative have been calling for trade union oversight of workload to take into account all of the different pressures due to the pandemic, including caring responsibilities. There should be no compulsion to carry out work if workers are no longer in a position to carry it out because of the lockdown, and full pay should be guaranteed for all. And looking to the future after the pandemic, To address the housing issue that's been hugely exposed and exacerbated due to the lockdown, we've been calling for a mass programme to build and renovate council homes, including outdoor space, gardens, playgrounds, as well as good quality, affordable housing for all. We also call for a system of free, state-run, flexible childcare for all ages, and this should be available to all parents when requested. To me and many others, it's clear that we should not and we cannot accept a return to the way things were before. The pandemic has exposed many of the contradictions and inequalities of capitalism. We must go forward and fight for a socialist society where the needs and the wants of the majority are put first. And I hope you will all join us in that fight. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you so much. I think that the role that women play with regards to the home and caring for the family is treated like something that's basically expected of women. And it's so undervalued and unpaid. And I think this crisis has really highlighted, like you said, how much effort it really takes, and how the fact that women bear the brunt of that labour is detrimental both to them, but also the work and the paid jobs. So thank you so much for that. And I think we've had a few questions in private messages, but also on the comments. But please continue asking all of your questions that you have for our panel. We want to pick some of them, so please continue asking. Now, our last speaker before we take some questions would be Becky, who will point us towards the way that socialist feminists should organise to fight back. So go ahead, Becky.
Thanks, Yara, and thanks to everybody who's spoken so far. To continue on from some of these points that have been raised already, I want to say that women are 51% of the population and 47% of the workforce, but are paid 18% less than men still. And 52% of women workers have been sexually harassed at work. Only 24% of chief executives are women, but women make up 55% of trade union membership. And I think that this is important because a woman's place is in her union. And this is because it's collective struggle, which is vital to defending our rights, jobs and pay as we battle against the government and bosses trying to make us pay for the crisis. But it's also vital for changing the world. And we're feminists because of what all of the speakers have said here tonight. Women can experience sexism, pressure to conform to damaging gender roles, have had to fight for control over our own bodies, are more at risk of domestic violence, are more likely to be burdened by childcare and housework. And we're socialists because as working class women, our speakers here tonight and millions of others have a double burden. They're exploited both as women and as workers. And this is shown in how the struggle to balance work and childcare isn't just something that many women have had to deal with during the lockdown. And it's shown in how before abortion was legalised in Ireland, women who could afford to travel could still get an abortion. Or those who could afford to have children had a real choice about when and whether to have them. And it's shown in how, when experienced domestic violence, if you're unable to afford rent on a new place to live, it's even harder for you to escape. And when looking at where we should place the blame, it's the capitalist system we put centre stage. Because capitalism means our lives are controlled by a tiny minority of powerful and super rich people, with their only interest being more profit for themselves. And this means constant attacks on our living standards. It's the capitalist system which benefits from the unpaid labour of women, which is worth about $10.9 trillion a year worldwide. And much of that work going into reproducing the next generation of workers. And it's capitalism that benefits in terms of making profit from the low paid work that women do in jobs such as caring and cleaning. It's also the capitalist system which benefits from division, from us blaming each other, from blaming men or others rather than those at the top. We see sexism and all forms of oppression as intrinsic to capitalist society. The oppression of women is one of the oldest, being linked to the creation of private property in class society. Alongside this came the family as a unit of control and the subjugation of women. Women of all classes experience sexism. It's not just the relationship between men and women on an individual level which causes oppression. It operates at a societal level. And that's why, as socialists, we think that we need to stand against all forms of oppression. We support the struggles of all oppressed groups, but we also try to link them together as part of a united working class and socialist movement. We have a common interest in fighting together, and that's important. It's true that women workers have had to fight historically for workers' organisations to take their concerns seriously. Sue talked about the early trade unions and the match women's strike. But when trade unions first developed, women weren't allowed to join. And it took the strike by the women match workers in 1888, demanding health and safety regulations and better pay, to kick off a new trade unionism, which saw women joining in the millions. And it's mass movements and strikes which will see real change for women today. The working class has a unique and powerful position because we are at the centre of production, withdrawing our labour through strikes and other forms of struggle and exert this power, bringing whole countries to a standstill. And the idea that well-behaved women rarely make history is a popular one right now, and it's true. A comment on women mobilising in the 1800s by an establishment figure showed their fear when he said that women mobilising was more menacing to the established institutions even than the education of the lower orders, and that fear still exists today. International Women's Day that we celebrated a couple of months ago on the 8th of March is a tradition that includes the Russian Revolution, which started on that day when female textile workers went on strike. And this further led to a revolution where the working class took power in October 1917. And the Russian Revolution in the early days saw massive gains for women, the legalization of abortion, the legalization of divorce, some of the socialized things that Fiona was talking about in terms of childcare and laundries and things like that. That was all achieved. And today, internationalism and women's struggles are spreading across the world. Prior to the lockdowns around the coronavirus crisis, we saw huge movements of women, particularly taking strike action and fighting back against lots of different issues. And as Eleanor was talking about, Socialist Alternative is part of an international organisation with members in many of these countries where these protests were taking place. And in countries like Brazil, where particularly Black and Indigenous women are fighting against the reactionary President Bolsonaro, under which 4 women are killed each day because of their gender. In South Africa, where women have been protesting under the hashtag #AmInext banner against rape and murder. In Russia, where domestic violence has been legalised. In India, where over 92 rapes are reported every day. And in Sudan, despite gang rape being used as a method of control by the military. But now, and during this lockdown and after the lockdown, working class people of all genders need to stand side by side. We need to refuse to pay yet again for a crisis we didn't cause, with our lives, our jobs, and our living standards. We need to take inspiration from the feminist strikes against violence against women and for reproductive rights. We need widespread strikes and organisation to launch an almighty battle, and we need leaders in the trade unions willing to lead. But we also need to make a more fundamental change in society. The fact that in thousands of years of human development, we still don't have equality, that 1 in 3 women globally will experience gendered violence in their lifetime, that we can't provide the most basic things to vast swathes of the population, shows that we need to get rid of this system and we need to get rid of class society. Many people watching today will hate Boris Johnson for what he's done during this lockdown and for the Tory austerity over the last 10 years. But also he has reactionary and sexist attitudes, where he's been talking about single mums producing a generation of ill-raised, ignorant, aggressive and illegitimate children, where he described young women at the Labour conference as hot totty, when he criticised modern men for their reluctance or inability to take control of his women. But we need to go further than feminising the elite. The likes of Theresa May and Hillary Clinton, who are supporters of the same neoliberalism, austerity and war, do not represent me or you. We don't need more women bosses to exploit low-paid women. previous gains for women, such as legislation on the right to vote, doesn't mean so much if there are no political parties that represent us. And legislation on equal pay doesn't mean so much if the minimum wage and the living wage is so low that even if we have equality with male workers, it's not enough to live on. Sexual liberation, which was gained by previous feminist movements on the basis of capitalism, has been sold back to us in the form of unattainable beauty standards and a beauty industry that's worth £30 billion in the UK alone. We need to build a socialist society that can liberate women from the economic inequality that we face, but also can guarantee genuine equality. And that's something that can't be gained under a system where just 26 people have the same amount of wealth as half of the global population. So Socialist Alternative, with all the speakers here tonight, is doing our part to achieve a socialist world, and we want you to join us as well. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Becky, for those really important points. And I think the speech has really highlighted why we have to go further than just, breaking the glass ceiling. We need to go all the way to dealing with the root cause of the problem, which is class society generally, but its current form, capitalism specifically. And now I think you've made the point very clear that now is our time to organise. But before we go off to organise, we have a couple of questions from the audience that need to be answered. So while I'll pull them up, I wanted to briefly remind our listeners that Socialist Alternative isn't just the name of our organisation, but it's also the name of our monthly paper. Issue 7 is out now, and it features many incredible articles from workers around the country. So you'll find articles about the Labour Party, about coronavirus, health workers and workplace disputes, and they're all written by the people on the ground. So all of that can be with you imminently in a sleek PDF form, in laptop or mobile version, for just a small donation of £1, or if you really want to support our activity further, then £2. Now, of course, we'll accept more than that if you want to offer, but just comment on this live stream and someone will get back to you with details. There's going to be a link below as well. Now that you've probably finished commenting furiously to get your copy, we can get back to the discussion. So I'm going to ask the first question. We have the first question from Danny, who asked, the majority of the NEU members are women who have most of the childcare at home, as well as working from home and going to support key workers' children, and are now faced with a return to work on June the 1st. So what can those workers do to fight back? And I think maybe Sue wants to answer this question.
Yeah, thanks, Danny, for the question. I was expecting this one to come up, funnily enough, seeing as there's been a lot of talk in the press and amongst teachers about the premature opening of schools on June the 1st. So Boris Johnson announced that on Sunday without any consultation with the teachers' unions or with teachers' leaders either. And there's been a huge resistance around that. So as I mentioned earlier on in my contribution, 7,500 new members of the NEU. So clearly there are education workers across the country. So that's not just teachers, that will be teaching assistants, that will be people that work within the school, within the school community, who are worried about the impact of going back into an unsafe workplace. So what can we do? Well, we have to acknowledge that, and that's something that I often have to remind people when they say, oh, the teachers' unions, the blob, as we're being labelled by Michael Gove and other Tories, and again recently in the right-wing press, that teachers themselves are also parents. And actually our union, the NEU, is made up of teachers. There isn't some kind of bully boy union leader who tells us what we have to do and we all roll over and do it. Trade unionism doesn't work like that. I think as far as answering the question is concerned, we need to support the NEU's 5 tests to go back, the five tests that the NEU have put forward. it's really good that we've had backing from the BMA and the head teachers union, organisations and associations, but we can't rely on that. We have to make sure that we build a bridge between teachers, parents and the wider community to resist the opening of schools before it's too early. There's huge concern about this amongst parents, and also as well a growing consciousness amongst teachers who've not been politically involved or motivated or necessarily organised within the union. They may be union members, but they've been card-carrying union members, but now becoming more and more involved because they can see the struggle ahead and they can see the issues arising in their workplaces and need to and want to get involved and want to become active within their trade union. So I think that's the important thing, building a bridge between teachers' building our teachers' organisation, making it as combative as we possibly can, going out and building within the wider community with parents around a slogan of no going back until it's safe. And then also developing a campaign around Section 44. We have the right not to go into a dangerous workplace. We can say, no, we're not going in there. So building a campaign around Section 44, risk assessments within schools, to give teachers confidence that they can say, we're not going to go in to an unsafe workplace. So I hope that answers your question, Danny.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sue, so much. I think the point about Section 44 is really crucial. We need to talk about this. We need to really prepare a fight around this issue. And I think I also want to hear Fiona about this question. So Fiona, do you mind coming in on that too?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I think that's what Sue said is really, really key. And certainly from the University Workers' Union, we've been watching with great interest the teaching unions get together and put out the 5 tests and the statements that they've done, and also the way that many teachers have been joining the education unions and getting involved. And I would say the key thing, certainly for me, as someone who has got childcare commitments and also involved in the trade union, is to make sure that you do get involved as far as possible as you can. And it is extremely difficult with kids, but I found that my union branch meetings have been very accepting on the Zoom calls to having my kids come in. I'm certainly not the only one who has kind of kids coming in and talking. And it's just about finding the time as well to get involved, and also make sure that local meetings are happening in your branches and that you're able to have some input. Because like Sue was saying, you haven't got someone kind of at the top necessarily dictating to you in the unions, and that's not always the best thing. It's to kind of also make sure that issues are raised as they come up, as you as members see them, and that you can push forward for them in that way as well. And I think that linking with parents is key, and a lot of teachers will be parents too, and getting involved with groups that are arising now, parent groups who are looking to support the teachers and support the calls to not go back until it's safe.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Fiona. I think that really added and made this answer really complete. Now, I have another question here from Michaela. The question is for Eleanor. What is the possibility of getting the abortion pill in Northern Ireland by post, as they have been under lockdown? So, Eleanor, can you take this one?
Yeah, so I suppose the first thing I would say is that the abortion pill is still being obtained over the internet by a lot of women in difficult situations, mainly from women on web. And the reason for that, I would say, is because even though the law has now changed, there are still great difficulties in actually accessing abortion, especially in the middle of a lockdown. And I think there is also, there has been an ongoing question of how medical personnel might feel not confident in administering abortions because guidelines haven't been fully brought in, or it's all kind of come in at a time when we're in the middle of another health crisis, the pandemic. So, you know, that is a factor that could impact on the willingness, I suppose, of some, not all, but some medical staff to actually provide abortions. And I think the reason telemedicine was not introduced in Northern Ireland at the same time as the rest of the UK is that principally that Robin Swan, the DUP health minister, resisted it. But more broadly than that, it's a political football already, because telemedicine has been introduced down south in the course of the pandemic, and Sinn Féin then took this issue up, which of course, you know, is a positive thing, that they were arguing for the introduction of telemedicine. But in doing so, you know, the DUP has a habit of disagreeing with whatever Sinn Féin happens to agree with, unless of course it's exploiting workers, in which case they're all on board with that, usually. But I would say that's the primary reason why there's been an impasse on this issue in the local executive, is that the politicians can't form agreement to the point where they would actually allow telemedicine to be introduced in Northern Ireland. And of course, it's an indictment of our local assembly that is the case, and I think it really underlines the fact that we need an alternative, not only to just sectarian politics, but we need a real alternative that is actually capable of creating a different society for working class people. I think that is the only way out of this situation in Northern Ireland, and that means building a cross-community socialist movement and fighting for socialism.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Eleanor. I think the situation is clearly absurd and we 100% need an alternative to it. And I think the work that you and our members in Northern Ireland generally, in Ireland as well, have been doing about this issue is incredible and really commendable. Now we have another question, the final question we're going to take, which is also from Danny, you've been killing it in the comments, who asked, how can workers of all genders build a fight back against Tory attacks on trans people and trans children? The GRA reforms are being shelved and the government are using this crisis as a chance to attack some of the most vulnerable people in our society. So, yeah, how can workers of all genders build a fight back? I think Becky can answer this question. Becky, do you want to take it?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, I think like the first thing is that it shows, doesn't it, how the Tory party was really just posing during the election period and the run up to the election under Theresa May, when she was wearing T-shirts saying this is what a feminist looks like, and they were saying that they were the party of reform on the gender recognition, and it's shown that as soon as you know, they've got back in, they've just shelved these things and turn away from that. But I think that, like, also the position of transgender people is obviously a very bad one in a lot of cases. The numbers of hate crimes that are against transgender people has been increasing. I think it increased by about 37% in 1 year. The levels of homelessness that exist amongst trans people, and so on, that 1 in 4 in the UK, 1 in 4 transgender people have experienced homelessness and things like that. It shows that it's, you know, linked to this kind of idea of not just about trying to get legal equality, which is very important, and legal rights, but also that like services are necessary as well, and that housing and everything else that people need to live is provided. And I think that one of the kind of debates that's maybe happened within the trade union movement, within the feminist movement, has been about this idea of kind of conflicting rights between transgender people and women. And I think that like we should reject that kind of narrative that these rights are conflicting. And I think that that is a kind of a recipe for disaster and a recipe for disunity, because what it means is that we're saying, no, we're more in need of this service. We're more in need than you. And the whole kind of idea of our movement is based on the idea of unity and the idea that an injury to one is an injury to all. And that's something that we need to try and bring back into the trade union movement. And if our trade union movement was fighting for services for everybody, for decent pay for everybody, and all of these kinds of things, then it wouldn't be so much of a problem, and we would be able to provide the services and the healthcare and the housing and so on that everybody needs. And then the final thing that I'd say is also that it links to why I think that we need to be socialists as well, because what we stand for is a rejection of all gender roles. These gender roles are completely damaging, and the idea, it benefits capitalism to kind of say, this is what men should do, this is what women should do, and that that there's two kind of binary kind of genders, that is, benefits capitalism. And on the basis of a socialist society, we would see that it wouldn't become important anymore, because people would have everything that they would need. And these kind of divisions between men and women and so on, and the use of transphobia and homophobia wouldn't be necessary in order to divide and rule people. So I think it also links to the need for change in society on a fundamental scale as well.
Thank you so much, Becky. I think the answer is really good, and I'm really glad that we had time to answer this question as well, because I think connecting issues of the women's struggle and the LGBTQ plus struggle, and especially the trans struggle, are incredibly important, and we can't really discuss those struggles without talking about each other and also about fighting capitalism. So I want to hear so much more, but unfortunately we've run out of time. But before we end the stream, I want to remind you all about the donation link in the comments. If you enjoyed the rally tonight, please use it. Any pound counts. And of course, in the unlikely event that my passionate speech before didn't get you to buy already, please don't hesitate to get the Socialist Alternative paper. It's got takes that you won't find anywhere else, and especially not in the capitalist press. So I know you want it, just get it. And also, I'm incredibly excited to announce for the first time here that our new podcast, Revolutionary Ideas, is coming out. So every month we'll take on a different topic that's relevant to Marxist theory, and we'll discuss it with activists. Revolutionary Ideas is aimed at everyone who's interested in Marxist ideas, whether it's your first encounter with socialist theory, or if you could recite the Communist Manifesto by heart from start to finish. We want all of you there listening to us. So our first episode is going to be on Introduction to Marxism, where we'll talk about what socialism is, how it's different to capitalism, and why everyone should become a Marxist. So it's going to drop next Thursday on the 21st of May. Follow our Facebook page to be the first to listen to it when it goes live. And please let us know what you think when it's live. And just to sum up, I want to thank all of the speakers and listeners today. There were loads of amazing discussions and questions in the comments that we didn't have time to discuss here. But that was brilliant. Thank you so much. And if you want to join us for our next events, don't forget to follow our page. We'll always advertise there before our events. So I hope you had an interesting time, and I hope to see you all soon. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.